It's now officially 3:01, so we can get started. Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our fourth Delta Stakeholder Engagement Committee meeting, and this is being held for the record today on Wednesday, February 12th, 2020. Thank you so much for joining us. Every single person in this room is busy, and you participate in a lot of other community-related commitments. So we want to be respectful of your time, and we really appreciate you working collaboratively all together to make sure that collectively our time is being optimized. And we'd really like to thank our hosts here at the Willow Ballroom in Hood. We appreciate the use of the facility and the support from staff in setting up this meeting. So thank you, Angelica, and it's a beautiful, beautiful facility. I just said I'd kind of like to get married again, just so. The purpose of the Stakeholder Engagement Committee is to create a forum for Delta stakeholders to provide input and feedback on technical and engineering issues related to the DCA's current activities. The SEC is a formal advisory body to the DCA Board of Directors. As such, and like the DCA itself, it is subject to the public transparency laws applicable to local public agencies like the Brown Act and Public Records Act. Again, for the record, please note, this meeting is not part of the Department of Water Resources California Environmental Quality Act public outreach process related to any potential Delta conveyance project. Therefore, comments made in this meeting will not be recorded or tracked for those purposes. Comments will be recorded and tracked, but for the purposes of our group, not CEQA. And now, Jasmine, could you please call the roll? Here? Here. 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 Thank you. And before I turn it quickly over to Valerie to go over some housekeeping items, I would like to welcome our new member, Peter Robertson. It's a pleasure to have you here, and not just because we're both recreational boaters and work for Caltrans, but it's always nice to have things in common. Would you like to say a few words about yourself?
I got up this morning, and it's gone pretty well from that. I am a lifelong boater, and I love the Delta, spend a lot of time here, raised a couple of families here, and we want to see things go as smoothly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Valerie?
Okay, we do have some housekeeping items. Please ensure all SEC members sign in with Jasmine. It's critical that we have an accurate attendance sheet. Note to the public, if you'd like to speak during public comment, please fill out a speaker card. Paulina is here, over here in this corner, and she has the public comment cards. So please fill that out. We have set aside time for public comment on agendized items and non-agendized items following the technical discussions. Please silence all cell phones. Please be aware that this meeting is being recorded and the video will be posted on the DCA website following the meeting. Restrooms are located, as I said, in this corner if you need to use the restroom. Fortunately, I don't think it's as much of an issue. You don't walk in front of the cameras if you can, please. In the event of an emergency, please be aware of where the exit doors are. If there's a need to shelter in place, please do so at your seat. The following materials have been provided to SEC members and community in the audience. They are both printed and on flash drives for the SEC members because we were getting some comments about internet availability, and so we wanted to provide the information on flash drives. I believe there's also a copy of the video of the last meeting because some folks were saying that all it did was buffer when in fact you'd go online because of the internet issues, and so we provided a copy of the meeting on on your flash drive as well. If at any point anyone needs that sort of thing, even between meetings, please let us know. We're really happy to provide you what we can as quickly as we can so that you can gather the information and do the research that you'd like. So the information we're providing today is obviously the agenda for today's meeting minutes from the January 22nd meeting, a question tracking packet, PowerPoint presentation, water facilities map per Dr. Lytle's request at one of our last meetings, an updated SEC member roster, an updated staff directory, the January, and as I said, the January 22nd meeting is also on the flash drives. We also have handouts including updated maps and other support materials.
Great. And now some reminders and meeting norms. As previously mentioned, all meetings are subject to the Brown Act. The chair, or in his or her absence, the vice chair will preside over meetings. The facilitator will guide the discussion. And in preparation for this meeting, I did talk with Valerie because I had noticed last time not all of the committee members actually participated in talking, and we want to make sure everyone is here because they have something of value to add, and so we want to make sure that everyone gets heard. Staff will provide technical information to support the committee's work. Each meeting will be goal-oriented and purpose-driven. Information discussed in these meetings are for information only, and the information is subject to change. And I think it's important to highlight that because this is a moving process, and no one is playing hide the ball here. The information that's being presented is the best information as of today, but that doesn't mean that it can't change in the future. And staff will make every effort to highlight when those things change so that people understand that. The committee holds no formal voting authority. We will seek consensus. All views will be listened to and recorded and reported, and participation in the SEC does not imply support for any proposed conveyance project. I know that's been an important issue for a lot of people here. And I would like to let the clerk know, to have the record show that member Karen Mann has joined us. Thank you. Meeting overview. Today during our meeting we'll be discussing the following. We'll have a follow-up and roundtable discussion on January 22nd SEC meeting materials, specifically intakes and member outreach, and we'll discuss the basics of tunnel drive, and we'll discuss launch shaft construction, site logistics, and key siting drivers. Okay.
Okay, so we are at that point where we are going to discuss the member roundtable. We really made it a point to reach out to all the different members with some prompts and some thoughts and some key areas where perhaps we, I think in the past we were saying, well, so, we talked about the project. Do you have any thoughts on some of the things that, you heard, that sort of thing? We wanted to get more specific because, frankly, we wanted to give you a space where you can aim, right? And so there's that. So we gave you some prompts. We'll go over those in just a moment. I also want to invite the committee members to talk about different outreach, different discussions they've had with various club members, all those sorts of things, of course, during this discussion. So why don't we kind of start there? Has anyone had an opportunity to do any outreach, to have any coordinated conversations, presentations in front of organizations that you're involved in?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I have, with the Save the California Alliance, we prepared, and I can pass one out to everybody, a copy of the proposed corridors. We mainly did the East Corridor just to kind of see. I'll take one and pass it around. And I also sent it to Nasli to make sure that it made it to the engineering team. Mm-hmm. But I wanted you to know that we were doing our homework as well in the Southern California Delta to show exactly how these waterways are used all year round. Thankfully, our delta is not a summer-only navigable water area. It is 365 beautiful days a year. So I thought I'd share that first of all with you. This came from one of our members who spent a lot of time.
Fantastic, thank you. And that sort of support is huge. It really does help our engineers. Nasli, I know, received it and immediately moved it on to the engineers so that as we begin to refine the maps, we can make sure that they're as complete and full as possible.
We
All right.
wanted to be sure that the committee and also the interested parties realized how many people's lives this will affect.
Perfect.
Karen, can I ask you a question? Does each of the yellow indicators, so would that, for instance, Wimpy's, it would be underneath that, where it's located on the,
It pretty much.
Okay.
It's not to scale, obviously.
right?
The other goal on this was to provide the readers and people that perhaps don't use the waterways as much as the rest of us, an idea as to where the different items are. For instance, Frank's Track State Recreational Area, where that's located next to Bethel Island, and Mildred Island. And you'll notice all the interesting colors around my community, Discovery Bay and Byron. Many concerns there. Many of our residents are very, very concerned, as well as the businesses. And may I also draw your attention to the primary route that traverses from Antioch, Knightson, Brentwood, Discovery Bay, east to Stockton. It's the primary truck route. It's a Highway 4. That is a very, very old bridge route. It is a single-lane levee. And I know that there was some discussion last time about the fact that the roads would be enhanced, but I'm not sure how you would enhance a levee road like Highway 4 that has considerable amount of truck and automobile traffic on a daily basis. That bridge is not very high from the water, so it would require bridge openings every time a barge would go through.
Thank you. I apologize, I skipped over review of the meeting minutes. So does anyone have any comments on the meeting minutes? Those had been circulated to you via email and have been posted on the website. Does anyone have any additions or corrections that they would like to make?
I just had one. It's Mike Moran. And on page 22, there was a comment attributed to me that was attributed to Philip, I can't remember his last name, from San Joaquin. There you are. Yeah, there we go. Merlo, thank you. And that's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth paragraph down.
Okay, we'll make that correction.
We'll make that correction. I'll go ahead and email it in. Okay, thanks.
And did you want to proceed with the roundtable?
Sure. Actually, at Big Break, we had 2 events. One was our King Tides event with the California Coastal Commission. And we brought about 50 people out to Big Break to look at the King Tides, and also had an opportunity to discuss Delta Conveyance in general, not specific to this particular project. And that was very valuable. A lot of folks had no idea, as a standard, what was going on. And then we also hosted the Delta Protection Commission's Delta Leadership Course, the class, last Friday. And Eric Vink very kindly asked if we can do about a half an hour program at the end of the day where we had about 10 of the members of the class come on out and just learn what's actually, how water moves through the Delta and actually what is the reasoning behind having conveyance, additional conveyance or isolated conveyance versus not. And it was very enlightening that a lot of folks had a lot of information, but even with a lot of information, folks were pretty surprised to find out about different ways of looking at water moving through the Delta. So very valuable.
All right, any other, yes, sir, Mr. Douglas.
So I had a meeting with some of the residents of the log community, and the residents of log community, they are mainly concerned about the process of construction, the rumbling of the trucks upon the 100-year-old rickety town. It's rickety, but then to us it's treasure and heritage. Anyway, so that is their concern, And then I also attended the public hearing on Monday in Warner Grove. And somebody brought forward again the topic about John Gaiman's deep water shipping channel. And so also I want to thank you for response to the question information request that you answered my question about the deep water channel. So in your answer, you say, it is possible to be put forward as alternative. So I like to see how we can work on that one. Yeah. Okay.
Great, thank you. All right. Okay, Ann?
I had some discussions with our some of our local reclamation district managers, and their take on it was that whether it's 2 or 3 intakes, it would change the hydrodynamics of the river in such a way, including creating reverse flows, and that reverse flow, because these are 3,000 CFS versus 300, which are the local water municipalities, or 25 to 30 for the local agricultural pumps that these farmers use to irrigate their lands. At 3,000 CFS, it would create such a change hydraulically that erosion is going to definitely be an issue. And the way that today that these levees are taken care of is that by property assessments of each of the folks that live on the islands by which the reclamation districts oversee. And so the increase in that erosion and repair of that erosion as a result of this increase of the hydraulics in the river would land squarely onto the landowners through the reclamation district's assessments. And that is something that would be unequitable, unfair, and not something that should be allowed to happen to the folks. And this includes all of the reclamation districts, and we have to understand the way that the funding works currently to make sure that we're not setting up a system where the taxpayers are paying for the construction and they're paying for the ramifications of the construction.
Thank you.
Can we ask questions about specific roundtable topics, or should we get through them all first and then ask later?
Why don't we get through them and then we'll ask questions. That way everyone's able to kind of do their thing. All right, Barbara.
I've had meetings since the last meeting with about 3 dozen local Delta environmental justice and statewide environmental justice organizations. And we have questions still around the truckload in terms of the construction schedule. And one of our primary questions is it makes sense that you're presenting the project to us top down, step by step. We understand you can only do so much in a meeting. But we're wondering, in terms of a construction outline, what's going to be happening simultaneously? Because if we're talking about 200 trucks to one part of the Delta and 200 trucks to another part of the Delta, that's where that cumulative analysis comes in. It's extremely important for the AB 617 communities in Stockton, around the Port of Stockton, to really understand what that true impact is going to be. We have about 30,000 commuters a day going to Sacramento from Stockton, and we have another 40,000 going to the Bay Area. So there could be huge economic impacts if there are truck trips at a greater level from 2 areas, because I would imagine Clifton Court Bay 4 Bay construction would be happening the same time as intake. So you're looking at truck traffic then going in 2 directions, not 1. And so we're wondering, has there been outreach done to the COGS for traffic analysis to get at what that would really be, and what are the real economic impacts for that? There's also a concern from environmental justice communities that if there is this amount of heightened barge and train and truck traffic coming out of the Port Stockton with extreme traffic congestion, that it's going to have an impact on the economic recovery of that city that is still lifting itself up out of bankruptcy. So we have questions about those economic impacts. If you look at what happened here with the arena or any city, whenever you have major construction, mom and pop businesses close. So we want to see kind of what the trade-offs were going to be, because if there are impacts at this level from so much movement, we think that's going to offset job numbers that are discussed actually from construction of the tunnel itself. Those are primary concerns. Also, we are interested to know what kind of outreach is being done with the Port of Stockton right now, because that is significant for their operations and would interfere with economic development. The port is expanding its opportunities in other directions. There was one other. And of course, we hear at every meeting great concern about harmful algal blooms and impacts on construction. So I'll just remind you every meeting that we're looking for answers there. Thank you.
Fair. All right. Yes.
So I meet with about half a dozen reclamation districts here in the North Delta every month. And the question that keeps coming back is, do they understand the impacts, just like Barbara was explaining? And that kind of threw me last month when we were talking about the design, because before this started, I was interviewed by the DCA staff, and they knew that I testified against water fix. They had all the details out that I talked about, and I know they talked to a lot of the other witnesses that were against the water fix. And so it was my understanding that when we came to these meetings, we would not only get the basics on the design, but we would get an indication that this process actually understood some of those impacts and would start explaining what I meant when I said dewatering is going to be a problem and that sort of stuff. And so it just struck me last meeting when we're talking about the intakes, and I had the same question in my mind that Barbara did. I mean, 200 trucks, that's not a big deal, but the old water fix, there were thousands of trucks. So when are we going to get the whole big picture on what this really means in the Delta? And then I think you really have to start thinking out of the box, thinking out of the design box. Anybody can design a project. The key is going to be the impacts that project has on the local community. And when I hear the dewatering around these intakes, I start thinking about some of the problems we have on these levees and the farm ground around here. And I'll give you an example. Everything's connected by water. Very porous levees, very porous foundation. And when you start dewatering things, it starts moving, just like the San Joaquin Valley and groundwater extraction and subsidence. It happens here quickly. I'll give you an example. About 5 years ago, we had a landowner in Grand Island appear at a district meeting, and he was bringing up a problem he was having with his house's foundation. That one side of his house was going down, and he's had to prop his house up. And he was concerned that the landowner regrading a field next to him and the district, how they ran water through their drainage system was a problem. And so we asked him to go back and get some more information, come back to us. In the meantime, I went out and looked at his property, and as I got up there, I could see right away what he was talking about, because the whole levee was moving. There was a big arc cracks in the levee, like the foundation was failing. And right away, I saw these eucalyptus trees that ran along the property line and ran up the levee. And I thought, I bet those eucalyptus trees are sucking the water out of this ground and causing everything to move. And so by the next meeting, he came back, and he had talked to a geotechnical engineer, and they had gone out and looked at it. And lo and behold, they came out with the same result, that those trees are sucking the water out of the ground, and the whole ground's going down. So this happens fast, and you're talking about dewatering deep. So you've got the first layer of sand that is the levee and the top layer of foundation. Then we've got this very weak, it's organic, but it's not peat layer that's going to start shifting. And then you've got the next layer of sand where a lot of water comes in under the levees. And when you start draining that, you're going to really impact the surface. And like I said, just this last drought impacted things pretty badly. And so that's the kind of thinking that has to go on when you present this information, is think about, what did I say in my testimony? What did Chris Nudek say? What did Dante Nomalini say? And address those questions, because we're going to have them again. You're going to get sued again. They're going to hire us again. And we're going to come up with the same questions. So if you could kind of nip some of those in the bud, I think that'd go a long way. And then the other thing that's come up over the last month, the question that was asked about getting the data from the borings that DWR already has from the channel or whatever, And the answer was, we don't know if we can legally give you that data. Well, that kind of threw a lot of landowners off. They thought, wait a minute, this is supposed to be a transparent process. This is Public Records Act material. Why do we have to go back to the Public Records Act? I thought this would be a venue where we could get that data automatically without having to go through that. So hopefully you've answered that legal question, whether we can get some of that preliminary data.
Great. Sean, did I see I'm sorry, Jim, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I talked to farmers and some folks in our community about the intake specifically, and the question came up that since this is the intakes are an encroachment on the Sacramento River, and as Anna pointed out, will change the hydraulic flows, the hydraulic characteristic in the river. So the question became, how far upstream and how far downstream will new infrastructure be put in place, either riprap, raising the levees, whatever, on the east bank, and also how does it affect the west bank since you're changing the east bank? So the big question was, do these intakes affect, how far up and downstream will these levees, the intakes affect the levees, and what kind of mitigation will be used? Additionally, there's always the question, as Gilbert's pointed out, about dewatering, where the dewatering water will be pumped. We assume it will be into the river, but it can't be onto the islands because the drainages on the islands are already used by the farmers. They're pretty much at capacity. So those kinds of questions have arisen. And the question of dewatering and subsidence is a big issue. I understand from the Alaska Viaduct project, which was a giant tunnel, that the dewatering caused the settlement in downtown Seattle. It wasn't the tunnel per se. So these are the kinds of questions that people want to know and want to have answers to. And I think this is the venue that DCA now has the opportunity to fill us in and treat us more than just the general public in sort of vague answers. Well, we don't know, we're studying this. Yeah, my sense is you know a lot more than you're telling us, and I'd appreciate it if you'd enlighten us.
Okay, and Sean.
I work with 4 environmental groups, and 2 of them are umbrella groups, so it's a broader reach than just those 4 groups. And the general consensus is we're frustrated. These are the same 3 intake placements resurrected from the last effort. The terrestrial species stakeholder group at that time during the last effort had worked to try and address the impacts from those placements. And this was so difficult that we had to create new experimental techniques to try and minimize those impacts. So to be clear, these placements were not selected with terrestrial species in mind. And as becoming increasingly clear, they were not selected with aquatic species in mind either. Their selection appears to be driven by engineering and cost considerations. We were told at the initial Stakeholder Engagement Committee meeting that we should expect to see our fingerprints all over the final project. We are starting to believe that this was a prescient statement, but not as intended. What is needed is for this committee to be able to shape the project, not leave our fingerprints all over the final design. A true stakeholder process will be looking at the placement of the stunningly environmentally disruptive intakes afresh, with a view to balancing and minimize the impacts to terrestrial and aquatic species and all the other concerns around this table. And to have as a mandate the consideration of whether or not we should even be designing a project that is so disruptive to the Delta.
Yes, Dr. Lytle.
Pretty quick. Had a number of discussions around in our area, and in the discussion, it primarily centered in on the development of this new eastern alignment. And just to fill out the logic path, during those discussions, folks were primarily questioning the concept of you've got your initial alignment, you're proposing now an eastern alignment, but where's the western alignment? And I think that that's a legitimate question as far as if you're truly evaluating the Delta for a project and excluding a very large western portion of the Delta, that's a good question. And so I think that that's something that's going to have to be addressed, particularly when there are, I know, congressional representatives that are supporting some type of Western type alignment project. And so that was the primary focus of the discussions that we had at this point.
Thank you.
I had one last
Oh,
piece. I
not a
forgot, if
problem.
that's
Go
okay.
ahead, Barbara.
The last item that we were wondering about for consideration is that in order to construct the tunnel, there has to be a lot of infrastructure that's in place. So we go back to what happened in the Waterfix case, power lines. You're talking about additional roads. You're talking about increased barge operations, perhaps a train terminal. All of those things take years to build. And even if you're granted a permit, if you don't have the infrastructure in place, you can't just magically kind of whip it up. Those processes in their own making could just be very, very difficult. And what we're concerned about is that if this committee is looking at total construction impacts, we should be talking about the disruption from the infrastructure that's even going to go into place cumulatively in the first place before you even start constructing on a tunnel. Because that is going to, whether you run it through the middle of the delta and you're dealing with subsidence, or you run it through on an eastern version where you have a much heavier urban population, it's going to up the overall environmental impacts across the board. So, that's it.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other comments? Karen?
I have a comment that one of my members sent to me today. May I read it?
Of course.
Thank you. It is clear that the intakes cannot be placed in any of the locations shown on the preliminary drawings for discussion purposes. That is, number 2 of the 3 locations of the previous intakes, 2, 3, and 5 of California Waterfix. Extensive evidentiary showings in the prior State Water Resources Control Board hearings and the Delta Stewardship Council hearings show that neither of these agencies can approve intakes in these locations because it would not be consistent with the Public Trust Doctrine, Water Board, or the Delta Reform Act, the Delta Stewardship Council. It is unacceptable to locate the intakes so close in proximity to Delta legacy communities. We understand that DWR wants to put the intakes in these locations only because they claim they have an existing water right at these locations. DWR will just have to accept the reality that they are going to have to put the intakes somewhere else and initiate a new water right in order to do so. The question is, when will a realistic consideration of the intake locations occur? That is, locations other than currently being discovered. Talking about the intakes at the current locations is a waste of time because it cannot happen.
All right, thank you. Well, Mike hasn't spoken, so I'm going to ask Mike to go ahead.
Yes. This has been a difficult conversation to even start in Solano County, largely because the intakes are pretty far away. While there's interest in it, there's been interest in this for a good many decades at this point, but the bandwidth right now is being taken up by the BIOP projects that are in Solano County and southern Yolo County. So the real issues that do come into play, though, with this project are changes in the hydraulic conditions that exist after. So you have issues of elevation, you have issues of water quality, which are of great concern to both the municipal and the agricultural water users in the region. Say, and I'm looking at areas around Prospect, Ryer, the Liberty area. Right now, we're facing, we're dealing with conversions of substantial acreages in the order of 10 to 15,000 acres in Solano County to support these projects. And right now, there isn't a great deal of But this way, there's not a great deal of love in any of these projects until those kind of issues get kind of put into the mix for this discussion. Is that what are those impacts? How are we going to make the folks you leave behind whole at the end of the day? And that the technical and the engineering stuff is all well and good, but it doesn't resonate with the local community here.
All right. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jim.
I had a chance to talk to a wide range of people, not just fishermen, and most of the comments from the fishermen come along the lines of why have intakes at all, that there were so many plans submitted when this project started up, that 7 different plans that wouldn't have taken water out of the Delta, and yet none of those seem to get any consideration. That's the kind of comments I hear mostly from fishermen. Then, strictly on chance, I happened to have a conversation with one of the members of the Delta Stewardship Council, who was, I don't know if he's still on the council or not, but was on the council that made the decisions. And he said that from what he's seen here, this isn't going to fly either. It's the same thing, just put into a single tunnel. And that they're still not, conforming to the laws that were, that initiated all of this.
Okay. Okay. All right. Any other comments with regard to the construction, the constructability, the technical aspect of the project? Anna?
So another thing that a couple community members and I were discussing was about levee maintenance and flood fighting. Little do you know that at night the RDs drive around our levees, especially during periods of high water, 24 hours a day. So all night long they're driving around and they're looking for soft spots or boils or water or anything that would damage or potentially cause a levee break. And the concern is that with this construction, there's going to be a disruption of that, which puts our communities directly in harm's way. And we would like to know specifically how you will overcome that challenge of not disrupting the routine levee maintenance, both during periods of high flood and just regular seasonal annual inspections that have to be done. How will we mitigate for that? How will we make sure that our reclamation members will be able to keep our community safe?
Okay. Any other questions, comments, any other outreach that's been done? I'm going to actually ask that we move to the next slide, just to remind ourselves, again, the discussion topics. We've hit them. I mean, in most cases. We may want to give some thought to any ideas of how to have public benefits at intake sites, something to perhaps think a little differently about, But any other comments with regard to, again, the questions that we've talked about, any questions from the intake presentation, thoughts on the layout of the intakes, thoughts on logistics for access to the sites, and again, any ideas on ways to have public benefits at the intake sites? Yes, ma'am.
I just have a quick question. A lot of people have brought up the differences between this project and the past project. Is there a document that exists that compares the two and highlights the key differences from the administration's perspective and why those changes are being made? Just for curiosity, because that keeps coming up in a lot of conversations I have too, and it seems like it's pretty complicated to explain to the layperson.
I don't think there's such a document.
Well, this project doesn't actually
Formulate
yet. So the previous project was very well documented. Right now, it's a single tunnel somewhere between 3,000 and 7,500 CFS. I think the best description you have of the project right now is in the NOP.
Okay. All right. One last comment.
So on the access to the sites, I did a very course survey of some farmers on this side of the Delta and asked them if they would be willing to give up their prime ag land to provide for haul roads, and the answer unanimously was no. In fact, hell no was pretty much their response, but I just wanted to let you know. And then also, it'd be really helpful. We have some experts here in the Delta that deal with screen intakes. It'd be really great to get an expert who actually builds these things and has lots of experience with this, especially the different intake screen versus the flat. I'd like to actually meet someone that's built them and have them come present to us and talk about it. Okay, so, but not, I don't think I think we had that banter last time, maybe not at the size or the scale. So Are there folks that have built it that big? And if they have, okay. Okay, so last time we said that there hadn't. So what's the largest intake you've built with that type of screen?
Which type?
Phil, could you use the mic,
the round,
please?
The round ones have not been built to the 3,000 CFS. That's true.
What is the size that has been built to the round?
Hey, Phil, can you speak into the mic because we're recording?
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Okay.
The largest screens are the same size as the ones I showed you last week, the 8-foot diameter. There just haven't been 30 of them put together in one structure. I believe the largest diversion is around 1,200 CFS for the T-screens.
Okay.
We are working directly with the people who build them. So, I mean, I know them on a first-name basis, so it's not like we're doing this in a vacuum.
Okay. And to be clear, there is no instance where you've had intakes of that size lined up on a river of that scale, right?
There are. So on the flat panel screens, there are two that are approximately the same size. One is the 3,000 CFS intake for Glen Calusa Irrigation District up by Hamilton City.
Mm-hmm.
The other one is 2,500 CFS at Red Bluff for the Tama-Calusa Canal. So those are the largest ones. They aren't, they're, tens of river miles apart. So they're not in the same proximity as these, yes.
So to be clear, there has been no example of 3 intakes within the same proximity of the same size using the T-screen, right? We're in total new territory.
Not of either screen type.
Of either screen type. Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay. I think we're going to...
If I can add a little bit to that. So,
yes, Gil.
Probably the biggest screen manufacturer around is right up the road in Freeport to ISI.
Yeah, that's who we're working with.
Yeah, so Russell Berry was at the last meeting. I don't see him here today, the president of ISI. And, these cylindrical screens, if they design them, they're going to be a battery of a number of screens. And if you want to see what one looks at, like, you can actually go up to their facility in Freeport, or RD 999 has one on the Sacramento River Pump House Road there. It's about 100 CFS screen, and they pull it out of the water this time of year, so you'll be able to see what a 100 CFS screen looks like.
Yeah, there are a variety of them in your vicinity. I mean, these guys are right here in the Delta, and they've sold quite a few of them. So the ones Gil mentioned, there's also the Natomas Mutual has a set that they can bring up on a hoist that you can look at as well. Plus, they have a smaller one in their yard that if you go there, they can actually run it for you, and you can inspect it pretty closely.
Valerie and I were just having a little side discussion here. It might be possible to have a tour for some of the board members who might be interested in taking a look at that.
And at this point, that is a consultant to the DCA, or?
No, they're just a manufacturer. We've been working with them over the years. I mean, they've done me and my colleagues have done a whole bunch of these different sorts of intakes around the area, and they've obviously, ISI has done them with a whole bunch of other people, so they've got a lot of experience with them. I mean, we've worked with them for projects all around the U.S.
Gotcha. Thank you for the clarification, and a tour would be great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Just a reminder, go ahead, Catherine. I was just going to say, you do have your question tracking packet. That is a document that will continue to evolve. As questions come in, we'll add them. As we get answers to old questions, we'll add them. There's dates. We're trying to organize it as best as possible to make sure that people are able to follow the bouncing ball. But please do take note of that, because a lot of the questions, like the ones that came up today, we handle in that document in order to make sure that there's actually something in writing that you can work from. Okay.
Right, so we definitely could do a tour. I think it would be helpful to see both the flat panels and the cylindrical. Maybe a trip up to Red Bluff that's at close proximity to the scale that we're talking about here, so that you can see it firsthand. In fact, I had, over the weekend, had started emailing some colleagues. I think seeing a launch shaft too is going to be helpful. So we're thinking about a trip there as well so that you can see what these sites look like. Because I don't think there's anything better than just putting your eyeballs on it so that, you know, you don't have to trust us necessarily, you see it for yourself. I did want to follow up on Jim. I can assure you there's nothing that we know that we're not sharing with you. You know, obviously the geotech work is a bit behind, so, we are taking a note, and your comment at the last meeting about the dewatering, and Gil, you as well, we'll follow up on that. So, I mean, we flew at a fairly high level on the intakes. We plan to keep coming back to them as our engineering moves along. What we're focused on in these initial meetings is really the siting, and then we'll dive deeper into those issues. But any types of issues like that that you want to make sure that we follow up on, please send those questions in, and we'll make sure they all get answered. So nothing is getting ignored. It all gets logged, and we promise to follow up on it.
Well, and to that end, actually, there was a conversation among staff in the interim between the two meetings, because occasionally we do get questions that come in, and so we are adding those to the question log, so they don't come emailed to us and then they evaporate. We're adding those to the logs so that they can be treated in the same way. If the committee's comfortable with that, we'll continue doing that. If you want that to be handled in a different way, we will, because again, this is your tool. But, you know, a couple days later, after the meeting, suddenly some question occurs to you. We want to be able to handle that. And oftentimes it's something that many of the others in the committee might be thinking as well. So unless we hear otherwise, we will continue moving in that direction. Okay.
So I'm reading at the bottom that you're saying there's going to be more information about sound control after your study by the sound acoustic. Sorry. So acousticians. Yeah, that was it. I chose the wrong word. So are these folks going to actually do on-the-ground survey here in the Delta? Like, are they going to?
We'd like to.
Okay.
Might need permission to get on some property. But.
Okay. And then we would like some transparency about how exactly or possibly the other levee across from where these intakes, will they need to be raised? Will they need to be widened? Will they need to be affected? Because that's a big question for folks in Clarksburg is, how, you know, there's homes right on the levee directly across from the intake site.
Phil, do you feel comfortable speaking just a little bit about some of the modeling that will be done around the hydrodynamics in the river with the intakes? Just so that you can, it hasn't been done yet, but it will be as part of the project. And I just want to make sure that you're aware. And as that work gets done, we will definitely bring it into the meetings.
So like she said, we haven't done much of this yet. We've started, the modeling in the river is going to go in several steps. So the first step is to run basically what we call a 1D model. Those of you guys who worked in it, it's the HEC-RAS model to assess the impacts of the intake structures on the river, figure out where it looks like they might have impacts if they do. But even if it shows that they're in compliance with core guidelines and things like that, the intention is still to run a minimum of a 2D model on the affected areas. And that should show where the changes are and what impacts might be happening on both sides, upstream, downstream, all that kind of thing. Now, it takes a while to move through those steps. We don't want to do them until we have a little bit more definition on some of the alternatives through the NOP process, but we are starting at least to set the stage for that. There's also modeling down the road for sediment management, that kind of thing that comes down the river. I forget the names of the specific models that you guys that work in it probably know it better than I do. We'll also do modeling, three-dimensional computational fluid dynamics modeling on the actual intake structures themselves for the more specific impacts to the flow streams. But those are starting to get pretty close to screens and that kind of thing to make sure we have uniform flow in the screens. So the intention is to do the full suite of state-of-the-art modeling on the whole river to assess those impacts and develop either solutions or prove that they maybe don't happen.
I want to be a little mindful of time, so I'm just going to raise that because we're about 10 to 15 minutes kind of off track, but it's good conversation. So I want to make sure we're just mindful of this.
I just have two quick questions. You brought up the whole idea of reverse flow and changing hydrodynamics throughout the entire delta as water flows through. And if one might assume that reversing flow with existing infrastructure, you might be changing the way the levees actually work. If we get into this later on, if we can find out where maybe flow might slow down, is there any potential for this project to actually enhance flood protection in particular stretches and reaches? And if you could answer sometime along the way, if the project itself could ever be used as a flood control mechanism.
So that will all be part of DWR's work in the CEQA process.
Great.
We won't handle that.
Okay, all right, thank you.
All right. Ceci. I'm working on it.
One substantial concern that I ran into in meeting with different groups and different people was the issue of the aquifers. All the water is provided from wells in the delta, all the farmers and all the residents, and the aquifers, like the peat soils, are delicate. What will be the impact of both the dewatering and also the excavation? It's pretty scary, and people are very concerned about it. Could we have a detailed map identifying the aquifers, identifying the groundwater through the deltas, so that when it comes to that, you'll know what you're dealing with?
Okay, wonderful, thank you. All right, I think we're ready to close down this conversation so that we can move on to the technical discussion that we're going to move forward with.
And there'll be plenty of time during the breaks to dig deeper into some of these questions. And great discussion, thank you.
Yeah.
Catherine, I think you're
Yeah,
up
I'm ready.
next.
So before we get started, I just wanted to introduce Catherine Marquez here with DWR. Carrie Buckman was at a scoping meeting today, and so Catherine will be stepping in her absence, and she may need to use a phone a friend card and may reach out to Ken Bogdan behind her. So he's also with DWR. Today we're going to talk about the launch shafts. You'll learn that these sites are required about every 10 to 15 miles along the tunnel alignment for launching the boring machines. They'll each require several hundred acres of land for construction. They're focal points of delivery of concrete liners that form the interior of the tunnel, and also the stockpiling of the tunnel spoils, or what we call RTM, that's created as the boring machine moves forward. Obviously, there's other activity on these sites, but those are the main logistical issues that occur at these sites. We'll give you a brief introduction of what happens at a launch site and give you some data on the number of concrete liner deliveries required to keep pace with the machine, and then we'll give you information on the acres of land needed for the stockpiling. And then we've also developed a methodology to evaluate different sites for locating a launch shaft, and then applied that methodology to sites that are within this 10 to 15 mile interval along both of those corridors. So you're going to see the results of that effort today. In contrast to the intakes, there's a lot more flexibility on the siting of these. There aren't outside regulatory agencies that are driving some of the decision making. So we're very eager to gain your insights on these. Both the methodology that we've used and the actual results of that ranking. This is the very heart of why this committee was formed, to leverage your knowledge of the Delta and to incorporate that into this engineering work to reduce construction effects. So while we have ranked the sites into general categories of favorability, we haven't selected any sites, and that won't happen without the consultation of this group. I also wanted to introduce the DCA engineers that are going to be doing presentations today. Andrew Finney will start the conversation. He's our lead geotech engineer on the project, and he's going to talk about the launch shaft what happens at the site and the construction that occurs there. And then Phil Ryan, who is our engineering manager, and also the intakes lead, will go through some foundational information on traffic counts and drive links to set the stage for the siting work. And then wrapping it up will be Graham Bradner, and he leads the levees and forebay team, and he's done quite a bit of work in the Delta on levees. And he's going to cover the shaft siting methodology and those results. So that's just an introduction of the team. We're trying to bring each of the team members that work on different aspects of the job before you so that you meet them, you get to know them, and feel comfortable asking questions directly during the meeting. Phil doesn't actually do all of the engineering on this project. We spread it out a little bit. So today we'll focus on the launch shafts, and then in the next meeting, we'd like to spend a significant amount of time getting your input on those and insights on those sightings. And then we'll go into the other aspects of the tunnel drive, which is the retrieval shafts and the maintenance shafts. So, and then if possible, any ideas that you have on some of the potential beneficial reuses of the tunnel material, because that drives a lot of the siting thoughts, at least in our mind. I hope what you'll see in this discussion around siting is an emphasis on logistics. We're sensitive to what you all are sensitive to, which is the truck traffic and that comes through the Delta. So in our minds, trying to balance, relieve some of the load from the roads and use some of the barging and rail access that exists in the Delta, and balancing the 3 different ways of moving goods and materials around the Delta, we think would be extremely beneficial in terms of reducing effects. So hopefully that'll come through in the maps that we've presented and some of the analysis that we've done. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Andrew, who will begin the discussion on the tunnel shaft sites.
So I'm going to note that at our last meeting, we kind of said, hey, go ahead and ask questions as we go along, and we didn't make it through the full agenda. So we're going to try to go ahead and just do the presentations and have the conversations that we typically have after the fact for clarifications. What I'll note is that Jasmine has provided everyone with the little notepad, so feel free to jot down questions and such so that you remember them, so that when we get to the Q&A part, you got it. All right, go ahead.
All right. I apologize to those of you who are sitting in front of me and facing away from me here, but the goal here is to give you an introduction to what happens at a launch shaft site, and then that leads into the launch shaft siting discussion. I think it'll make more sense if you understand tunneling in general. So here we're going to address the key components of a tunnel drive. And we have the tunnel launch shaft, which is just what it sounds like. The tunnel boring machine is launched from that site. It's where the majority of the activities go on at a project that involves tunneling. The tunnel machine is lowered into the ground. The RTM is removed from the tunnel and brought to the surface, and the concrete segments that construct the tunnel themselves are introduced into the ground there. Not just general overview, but not part of today's discussion. A maintenance shaft is a typical intermediate location where you may generally essentially pull the TBM into that shaft so that you could inspect the front of the TBM, do any routine maintenance, and make sure things are still advancing properly and there isn't too much wear. And ultimately, you would retrieve it at the tunnel retrieval shaft, which is the termination point. Again, those last 2 are not today's topic. So we think, given the state of technology with tunnel boring machines and given the Delta soils at the tunnel horizon, we're estimating 10 to 15-mile tunnel drive lengths are acceptable. And that's important also from a logistics standpoint, that drive length. So main activities at a launch shaft site. As Catherine said, and we mentioned, it makes sense, you launch the tunnel boring machine, you deliver the concrete segments, the precast concrete segments that are gasketed that form the ultimate tunnel lining. You remove the spoils or the RTM, and then additionally you supply power, ventilation, worker access, emergency access.
moving on that side of
Oh.
the speaker.
This, get closer. All right, I can do that. I'm left-handed, but I'm not really. Okay, we'll try this. Okay, so this is hopefully this will work. Jasmine, is it going to work? Press what?
Or click it again.
Nope. Oh. There we go. So this is an animation. Here's the RTM. This is the tunnel boring machine at the end. This is called the trailing gear, which can be hundreds of feet. Here's the RTM being transferred up into the launch shaft here, offloaded onto a conveyor system. The conveyor system moves the RTM around the site. Here you'll see some of the precast concrete segments being delivered on the site. In the background here you can see some of the stockpiles. So as we zoom out here, you'll see the conveyor system would take it, in this particular case here, through potentially a mechanical dewatering system to a point of temporary stockpile here. And again, here's some of the shaft worksite area. This is just a static picture to show you some additional features here. So at the top of the site, that could be a rail link, a rail spur, or depending on where the shaft is located, it could be also a barge landing facility if you were transporting segments and RTM by barge. Again, segment stockpile, but by far the largest area at any given site could be the temporary and permanent stockpile of the actual RTM itself. In this particular scenario here, the acreage is focused on the 6,000 CFS alternative with a single 15-mile drive. Obviously, these volumes, and we'll get into that a little bit later, obviously those volumes are different and those areas are different. Here's the shaft site here. I think that kind of explains it. So this is a little bit about the construction sequence and the timing here. So at the end of 6 months or so, you will have prepared the site, which in some cases, if you're dealing with peat soils, may actually have to include some ground improvement, certainly in certain areas. You would have constructed, some rail sidings or spurs or barge landings prior to this. At year 1, you will have completed the construction of the raised shaft pad site and begin some of the facilities here, dewatering, cement, contractors, trailers, that kind of thing. At the end of year 2, you will have completed the shaft and you will begin to stockpile some of the concrete segments. You will have prepared your RTM area. And then at the end of year 3, you'll be tunneling. Here's a full stockpile of segments here. Yeah, I think that's kind of self-explanatory. So we're going to discuss the two key components, the two issues here at the site. So you have RTM being generated at a launch shaft site. That's the thing people need to understand is the RTM, or the spoils, are not generated at the maintenance shaft sites or the reception shaft sites, right? All the soil that's excavated from the ground comes back to the launch shaft site. So that's why it's so important and has the largest footprint. So again, RTM is the material extracted from the tunneling process. It's comprised of clays, sands, and silts, Mother Nature's materials down at the tunnel horizon. It comes out of the consistency of toothpaste, generally. This particular tunnel boring, we anticipate that it would be an earth pressure balance type tunneling machine, but the other alternative is called a slurry tunnel boring machine. Soil conditioners are typically used with earth pressure balance machines to maintain the consistency of the soil as toothpaste. If the material's moisture content is too high, it can be mechanically or physically dried prior to stockpiling. And then there would anticipated to be a continuous soil and water testing program to confirm the quality of the material for beneficial reuse. That's ultimately the goal. So on the far side here, you'll see the materials being loaded onto the start of a conveyor system. Here on the lower left, you see the conveyor system, and then on the right, you see the material being dropped into a stockpile. And this particular example here shows either it's just rained or there's material draining off from that. That would either be in a bermed off and sealed area, or the material would be mechanically dried prior to stockpiling to avoid that scenario. Let's see. Okay, so some of the different drying alternatives, again, and drying is important. The material comes out at too high of a moisture content to be directly beneficially reused. And so you could either dry it on land, just the way you would any soil for an earthwork project, by spreading it and disking it and allowing it to dry. That obviously would not work in the winter, so it's seasonally affected. I should mention that either the land application and the air drying or mechanical dewatering, there's a number of things that would go on in terms of dust management. That's an important part of any project. Also stormwater runoff management. Any sort of water couldn't leave the site without being captured, potentially treated and tested and that kind of thing. But anyway, the land application, so it's land intensive, as you would imagine. So it takes a lot of, you can't spread it out in 6-foot lifts and expect it to dry in a few weeks, so you'd have to, allocate area for that. And that's what you saw on the previous slide. Mechanical dewatering can also be implemented. Here's the number of centrifuges where you essentially spin the material like your dryer does to at a very high speed to remove water. Also, mechanical filter and belt presses could be used to reduce the moisture content there. And those could be housed indoor to allow seasonal water content reduction in the RTM. So a typical RTM testing plan, so you want to make sure that the RTM is not, there's nothing in the RTM that would be hazardous or to either the environment or to humans and both soil and water. So what we would do is we would essentially segregate maybe a week's worth, these are the details we'll work out, but segregate a certain amount of the material, run tests on it, taking samples. The samples are logged and profiled. You would say this is week 64's worth of soil or week 10's worth of water. And then you hold those, like I said, in designated zones. Once the testing comes back, if it indicates it's acceptable and meets requirements, then you would release that material or move on to stockpiling in a different area. Unacceptable material would be identified, follow-up testing would be completed, and then ultimately, if it was designated as unacceptable, it would be hauled off-site. So we have a number of environmental engineers on the team that are intensively reviewing the currently available environmental data associated with the soils as sampled from the 2009 to 2012 geotechnical investigations. And so some of the initial observations is the metals generally. We live in a valley that has a background level of certain minerals and metals naturally occurring, and generally the metals content of these samples resemble the background levels. There was some evidence that cadmium appears slightly elevated in some of the samples that they collected over those years, but that doesn't appear, none of them meet or anywhere near the human health risk assessment type levels of cadmium. There were a few detections of, for those of you, TPH is total petroleum hydrocarbons. So some of the environmental testing included shallow samples as well. They're probably leaking underground storage tanks or things like that. But there was one detection, if you will, of a TPH range sample out of all the laboratory testing performed in those earlier samples. And obviously additional sampling will be conducted. So when they're, as part of the geotechnical investigation, just as important is the environmental testing, both from naturally occurring issues such as naturally occurring hydrocarbons, naturally occurring metals, and then any potential contamination. And then our environmental engineers are developing what they call exposure scenarios. So that's to make sure that dust is a big part. That's an exposure scenario, just the same way that residential is an exposure scenario. If you built a house on top of the pile of RTM and started building a garden, they want to make sure that they understand the pathways that people could get exposed to these different soils. And they're evaluating alternatives to control RTM particulate matter. Again, dust control is very important. So we have the RTM, we've confirmed that it's suitable for reuse, and now the question becomes, What are the alternatives for potential beneficial reuse, right? And I just want to touch on these briefly because this is going to be the subject of the later February meeting. We'll get into this in more detail, but the primary, if we're talking about a southern forebay and we're talking about a large earth project that involves an embankment, then the goal is to reuse this material to construct that embankment, again, if it's environmentally acceptable, which we believe it is right now. There's no point to have to haul all that material into the delta with all the truck traffic that would cause. Other mitigation projects related to the delta conveyance or another potential beneficial reuse, other reclamation districts, levee maintenance. I think we've identified there's something like 12 million cubic yards of RTM or material for levee improvements that all of the combined delta RDs need. Other restoration projects in the delta, land subsidence mitigation projects, road improvements, and commercial sales. These are just some of the possible local beneficial reuse alternatives. So we told you the RTM is coming out of the ground. Going into the ground to support the ground is the precast concrete gasketed segments. So on the far right there, you see a completed tunnel. That's very similar to what we anticipate here. They're reinforced concrete. They're shipped and stacked at various heights. And they're typically provided and designed by the, they might be provided and manufactured by the tunnel contractor at a new or purpose-built facility. And then they would be stockpiled, as you saw earlier, at the launch shaft. Again, just like RTM, you wouldn't necessarily need a large number of the segments at any of the other shaft types. It's just at that launch shaft site where they go into the ground and get erected in the tunnel, as you see on the right there. So we took a look at potential precast liner fabrication sites. So there's a number of sites that are already existing in and around Stockton. And then these are just very preliminary, but additional locations where we think that there is potential to develop a precast segment construction yard there. Now this is important. For the 6,000 CFS capacity tunnel, every tunnel drive needs approximately 50 segments per day. And that's to meet the demand of an average of 40 feet of tunnel advancement per day. And, the delivery options are, you could deliver that by 25 trucks per day. So that's 25 trucks per day per tunnel heading or per tunnel that's going on, or one single rail car delivery or one barge delivery. So I think, in many projects, many projects allow the contractor to select the facility to construct essentially cast these precast concrete segments. Our preference, though, is to identify those ahead of time, or at least a range of alternatives, so that we can identify and account for the transportation impacts that are associated with that. So again, we really prefer, there's a number of things that we're looking for here, and we'll talk about this in future sessions here, is we want precast fabrication sites near rail or barge access, right? Because we want to really minimize the air pollution and other impacts that come from trucking that. So that goes for both, we'll talk about that as it relates to the launch shaft siting and one of the key criteria there, but also we have a preference for the potential fabrication sites to be near barge or rail access. There we go. Oh, there we go. I think that's the end of the presentation, and I guess, Catherine, do you want to open it up?
Do you want to take questions after each session? Okay.
Yeah, I think.
So I think at this point, we would like to ask for some questions, and I know just even for myself, a lot of things have come to mind. So
we're going to save yours for later.
First? I'm sorry?
Jim, I think, was first. I saw people, by the way, writing furiously. So what I will say is that, let's do some Q&A. We can then take a break and perhaps get some individual questions answered. and perhaps then we can move on to the next discussion. So if we do, say, 10 minutes of Q&A right now, just to keep the meeting time-wise on track, that would be great. That doesn't mean we're not going to answer all the questions. Again, many of the questions can be submitted, and we can go ahead and add them to the list. Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, when you talked about water being reused or disposed, how do you dispose of the water?
Well, I don't think we've answered that completely, but it would be, obviously it would go through an environmental process, right, to make sure that it was suitable for discharge. Either it would be discharged into the river, or, there's a number of alternatives, land applied if that's suitable, but obviously that wouldn't be suitable in certain places, so.
Okay, then my other question was, when you talk about the drying process, does that create odors?
Does it create odors? The drying process itself wouldn't create any odors. I think the question about whether the soil would off-gas anything is something that's important and needs to be addressed as it relates to things like naturally occurring hydrocarbons and or organic materials. But that's part of the environmental sampling that we will be conducting. Part of the benefit of using some of the soil conditioners is it helps to bind the water to the soil particles themselves, so that things like odor may not be as big an issue. But it's a valid point, and we're going to be doing the studies to look into that.
All right. Barbara. And again, we're going to do 10 minutes. So if you have several questions, and if you could cut it to a couple, and then we could kind of move on to the others, that would be fantastic.
I guess for today's presentation, it's supposed to be, a short presentation at a 30,000-foot level. But so much of this has already been discussed through Cal Water Fix. And so I feel like there is just a lot of detailed information that is being left out here in relation to soil. I'm just going to, methylization of mercury. Do soil conditioners methylize mercury? There is legacy mercury throughout the whole delta. It is the primary concern for water quality at the State Water Resources Control Board. So I have a real hard time imagining what you can do with spoils as a result of legacy mercury in creating habitat projects, et cetera. They certainly wouldn't be beneficial to fish. So I do have questions about soil conditioners, aggravating methylization of mercury. There's arsenic, there's chromium-6. I understand you said you're going to be doing the sampling, but that was already in the engineering report. So I guess what I'm looking more from this committee is more detailed information on how you're going to mitigate. And I think that comes now as a discussion of construction impacts. I have lots of questions about the tunnel segments when they're put together, what is going to be the seepage, questions about air pollution, not only the truck traffic with the off-batch sites, those are small two-lane roads also. 25 trucks maybe isn't horrific, but then you have the concrete process itself, which creates more gas and air pollution as well. I'll stop right there so other people can talk.
I will say that the logistics part of this, as it relates to, will be discussed later on today.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I appreciate that. All right, we're gonna go with Philip. Philip.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking off Barbara. I'm curious, and again, maybe these are questions that will be answered at a later date. How much noise will be produced by the actual shaft boring process itself? How many tons of concrete will be poured on these various landing pads? And correspondingly, how much peat dirt is going to be displaced in the process of excavating? And when they do displace that peat dirt, what mitigation efforts will be made to make sure that the peat doesn't aerosolize into the atmosphere and increase the asthma problems that we deal with in the Delta? And then, let's see, the last one was, there are a lot of schools within 12 to 15 miles of either tunnel shaft pathway. I kind of cheated and looked at the facility corridors and just looked. You've got Walnut Grove School. You've got the school in Terminus. You've got about 9 schools within 15 miles. Oh yeah, you've got schools up in Clarksburg as well. Ileton, yeah, there's a lot. Quite a few schools in West Stockton, west of I-5, both north of the port and south of the port. And, there's pretty good public health. There's a lot of recognition in the public health community that noise, air, and water pollution cause declines in cognitive development as well as academic performance. So I'm just curious, with the launch shafts having such a huge environmental imprint in terms of potential air pollution, potential water pollution, et cetera, what types of mitigation will be provided to schools in terms of noise, air quality, and water quality? Thank you.
So I just want to, I don't know.
There you go.
Okay.
It starts. At some point it starts.
So I just want to, both comments were made sort of in the same vein related to mitigation measures, and I just wanted to remind everyone that a detailed environmental analysis will be conducted and the mitigation measures would be discussed during the SEQA process.
Go ahead. What do you want to say, Susie?
Could you identify the composition of the soil conditioners?
Yes. So as part of the earlier work in 2014, a number of the available what are considered environmentally friendly soil conditioners were tested, and they are essentially long chain sugars. Now there are other manufacturers that make not environmentally friendly ones. Those are completely off the table for this project. Those are more petroleum-based, but for the environmentally friendly ones that are biodegradable, they're just long-chain sugars. They're foaming agents, essentially. And our environmental review of this indicates there's no. These are materials that their material safety data sheets just say, don't pour it in your eye. There's no harm to the environment and to the air or to ingesting it or anything. It's just don't put it in your eye.
Could you provide us with a list of their actual names?
Oh yeah, we can do that. Absolutely. The only concern is that manufacturers come out with new ones, but we can certainly provide you with the names of the ones that were tested.
So one of the clarifications I wanted was 225 acres per launch shaft. So how many launch shaft pads are you proposing? And then going back to the soil conditioners, do you have to remove the soil conditioner from the soil before you reuse it, or do you leave it in place and it's the person's problem that it gets spread on their land? And then how do you analyze the cumulative effect of the existing chemicals and then the chemicals that you are introducing into our environment, and how do you figure out if it's really safe for us? Because
that's what I was suggesting. So the environmental engineers, that's what they do. They're human health and ecological health risk assessors. That's part of standard cleanup operations on an Air Force base, for instance, is making sure that, and typically they would clean to what they call a residential standard, so they can allow base housing or redevelopment of a site like Mare Island or something, where people grow vegetables in their backyard and consume them, and they make sure that whatever level of naturally occurring or man-made components are safe for that scenario. So that's what we're conducting right now. Now, you had a couple of questions there. One of them was, but again, the naturally occurring biodegradable surfactants or foaming agents that are used for tunnel boring, like I mentioned to CC, are actually long chain, essentially sugar. So they're very benign.
How many launch sites are you proposing?
Phil, you want to answer? I think it's. Yeah, that's going to be part of it.
We'll be going through that today.
Okay, can I make one more request? So it's very frustrating when you say, oh, it's just one barge trip or one train trip, because everybody knows that what goes has to come back. So we prefer that you include a round trip. It's not one trip, it's 2 trips. 2 times the bridges have to go up.
One
2
round
times
trip, yeah. And 2
Well, so that's 50,
passages.
50 truck trips, right? I think that's an excellent point.
Right.
I think the numbers were shown that's an excellent point, but they're just in relative, it takes 25 trucks off the road to do one rail trip, but excellent point.
Okay. I saw Dr. Lytle, I saw Gil, and then I saw Karen.
Thank you. Just one question, maybe a little bit wider look at this as far as I'm trying to understand the concept of tunneling. There's been this proposal for tunneling underneath the delta, and tunneling is happening throughout the world. I understand that part in very different conditions. Catherine, you were a great tunneler underneath the city of New York, and so part of your early work. And so I guess that was a hard rock type of tunnel. Is there been anywhere in the world that a tunneling project of this magnitude in these types of conditions, this type of length, has ever occurred?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean,
could you say where?
I wish we have we can get you a list of all of the various, major tunnel projects that have occurred. First of all, this type of ground is unique. I mean, obviously, there's superficial soils that are extremely unique to this area, the peat thickness and the soft soils, but at the tunnel zones that we're talking about, this type of mixed alluvial soil, sands, gravels, clays, silts, that's very common tunneling ground. But in terms of the length, I think we could provide the committee with a list of other projects that have been completed. I should mention we also had an independent technical review where we had some of the foremost North American and Japanese contractors come in and some other, well-heeled consultants, if you will. And because one of the big issues was the tunnel drive lengths. And that's a balance between schedule, cost, impacts. Obviously, if we half the tunnel length, then you have twice as many launch shaft sites. And so that means twice as much of the more impactful, launch shaft site operations. So that was one of the things we've already, as I said, brought a panel of experts together. But I can certainly provide you with a list of other projects where similar drive lengths have been conducted.
Also, I think the soil conditioner, I know you say it's just sugar chains or things like that to produce foaming agents, but when you look at these manufacturers of soil conditioners, I mean, it's typically proprietary information that's in those compounds that you don't know what's in it. And so I don't think it's valuable for right now to just say it's just sugar chains. Because even in your studies that you did on RTM back in 2014, if you go back and look at the sections, there's lots of questions about the quality of the RTM. I think RTM, using it as an acronym, is a misnomer. If you call it spoils, I think it's more appropriate because we don't know if it's reusable based on the chemistry of the site. One of the things you talk about is, there's maybe some cadmium in there, maybe some arsenic. Maybe we can deal with that part. You can't because of the chemistry that you'll develop. But one thing you're totally overlooking is the salinity of the groundwater. The groundwater underneath the delta is saline to highly saline. And you bring salt water up to the surface, what do you do with it? Do you dry it out? Do you discharge it into the river? I'd like to see you try to get a permit to discharge salt water into the river. So I think this is a discussion I think you just can't blow over because this is an inherently difficult thing to deal with. I don't know how many million cubic yards of spoils you're going to have now, but it's a fundamental thing that really has to be addressed to try to get some of our concerns. And I'm not even looking at the concept of environmental impact. I'm just looking at how are you going to be feasible? You propose I think a major spoil site on Blunden Island on the southeastern tip, which is directly upstream of our water intake structure. If any of that water, whatever it might be, contaminated with arsenic, cadmium, I don't know what's in a conditioner as far as any kinds of organics, I think you really got to be understanding what's our sensitivity to that is. And so, so it's very, very, very important. Last comment, these launch sites, I think I read in the notice of preparation, I'm not trying to get into the secret component of it, elevated 45 feet on an island. Very significant issue, just based on its engineering and being able to construct a site. I mean, Gil, you can make a better comment than I could, but based on our experience in the Delta, particularly with any muck soil sites, it's going to be very, very difficult. So from an engineering point of view, our intake pump station settled over 2 feet because of muck soils. And so it's something, we had a telephone pole outside our facility during the construction when Phil was brought in to stabilize the site. The telephone pole moved 13 feet overnight. And so, I mean, the Delta is very dynamic. One last thing, levees. You have launch sites. You have to consider the levees protecting those launch sites and logistical access to them. If you don't, you put your entire project in jeopardy. And so those are my comments.
Thank you. I'm going to encourage Gil and Karen to kind of move quickly. Again, we've valued. Pardon me?
Melissa had her hand up.
Oh, Melissa, I'm sorry, I didn't see you either. So if we can do the three and then kind of, again, we can expound either offline or in writing.
Right.
Again, we're just dealing with the challenge of time, so I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Gil?
mine are pretty basic. So the first question is the RTM going to be subject to waste discharge requirements? And if so, that's what Mel was talking about. Putting this material, even on the back of a levee, is now going to throw us into a situation where the water board assumes that every drop of water underground is drinking water quality. And so it doesn't matter what it has in it, it's going to be hard to comply with some of their requirements. And the other question I have, a couple questions. One, back to Mel's question about the levees. Do you plan to rehabilitate the levees where your launch sites are? And if so, to what level, as far as protecting your construction operations? And the last question is, what goes on between these launch shafts? I recall in the original water fix, there might have been dewatering along the pipeline or power lines or something else that was going on in addition to just construction of the launch shafts.
Yeah, so the first question was are these subject to waste discharge? And I touched on the procedures of a typical screening process whereby we segregate a given shift or a given week's worth of production, conduct sampling. And so the answer is no. I mean, if it's currently as the environmental tests suggest it is, or they show currently.
So, I just wanted to explain. We'll be going through the environmental review process, and we'll be determining which types of permits will be required. And part of those permits would also be a robust sampling program, such as the example that Andrew gave.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and my concern was where we received it from the material. Because if it is going to be used on levees, that's where the issues have been with the latest dredging issues that we've run into. That's why we haven't reused dredge material in a long time, because we can't certify it to be clean enough to put on the back of a levee.
Okay.
Right. This material is from 100+ feet down. This is Mother Nature's finest. I think the only the only thing in there really is, it doesn't have a lot of organic material in it, so it might need to be amended to grow, but.
I'm just telling you what the regional board throws at
That's
us.
right.
We'll figure it out.
Okay. I do want to move to Melissa first, please, and then Karen. You'll pass? Thank you, Karen. Melissa, go ahead.
Just one question, and that is, has DWR started consulting with tribes? I'm not sure if you know that. And just as a reminder, when we're talking about the lawn shafts and the staging areas and, of course, levees, that's very concerning. And so I just wanted to throw that question out.
So when the notice of preparation went out, we also sent out AB 52 consultation letters and other notices to tribes that aren't currently on our AB 52 list. We have gotten those requests in, and we're going through those and setting up our initial consultation meetings.
Great, yeah, we just didn't hear back, so we were just wondering if you were consulting, so thank you.
Okay. So with that, we're going to, again, temporarily close down the discussion. We're going to take a break. We're frankly going to pick up similar discussion as we move forward. So if you have some big question that you want to hit that I'm sure everyone else would love to hear the answer to, we can always handle that on the back end of that discussion.
Okay, so we're going to be taking a 10-minute break, and please note that there is food for the SEC members at the side of the room. And given that we have a very short break, if everyone could defer and allow the SEC members to grab a bite to eat, and then we'll open it up to the crowd. Thank you so much.
Okay, just before we get going on the next technical discussion, I wanted to, it was brought to my attention that a lot of the comments that are being made, that we should remind you that in fact those are phenomenal comments for scoping with regard to alternatives and options and questions about things that should be studied. And as a reminder, there are still a number of scoping meetings that are set to happen, Stockton and on February 13th, Clarksburg February 19th, Brentwood February 20th, and Reading on March 2nd. So, as a gentle reminder, this is, again, we're focusing on, and the discussion has been fantastic, let's be clear, but we are focusing on construction and construction effects. Any comments on, mitigations or alternatives, we really encourage you, because, again, this is rich discussion. Please do include that information in your scoping comments.
So you just told them about all the meetings that DWR was putting on?
I did. And as a reminder, those are DWR meetings, not DCA meetings. You know this, but just as a reminder.
It's always good to be reminded.
I think Michael had a question.
Madam Chair, just a question. We've been getting some great comments and information from folks, but I'm not sure of its source all the time. And I just came and I see one for a Western Delta intake concept. And I don't know if this falls under Brown Act comments or anything like that. Just want to check the propriety of this.
Is this what you're talking about?
Valerie, would you like me to respond?
Yes, please.
So that was provided by a member of the public, so it should be treated as a public comment, please.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying. I think we were all a little confused. Okay, Sarah.
Okay,
All right.
so we are just on, I thought Barbara should just take this, but what
I
the
need
heck?
you to lean in.
We are now
We
leaning
need you
in
to
with,
we need you to
oh,
lean in.
sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So now we're going to go to Phil, who's going to do stuff on site logistics. So Phil, could you take it away, please?
Okay, is my mic live? Okay.
It is.
Wait, I'm sorry. I thought you said you were going to take a few more questions after the break, that the conversation was continuing.
We're going to
before
take
this.
the questions after the next presentation, which will be on similar discussion. So because we need to get the technical discussion moving. So I'm sorry, I don't want, it's just a time factor. Thank you.
Okay, are we ready? I'm going to do a relatively short presentation here just to kind of orient you around some of the numbers that are in your package. So this is about the logistics. I'll go through it pretty quickly and help you understand some of the stuff that you've got. So basically, Andrew went over tunneling and launch sites and that kind of thing. So a couple of reminders. There's a substantial construction area required. We're going to stockpile the RTM, which can be a large quantity of material. There's a potential loading and hauling of the RTM at that site. The tunnel liner segments are delivered and moved to the tunnel at that site. And transportation logistics is one of the key factors at these sites. So access to rail or barge landings would obviously divert a substantial amount of traffic off of the roads. You can bring in a week's worth of segments on a train delivery versus having to have the 25 trucks per delivery per day. So that obviously offsets a lot of that traffic. Okay, so let's, again, in a reminder, the tunnel drive lengths, that dictates the number of liners, the diameter does as well, needed, and the amount of RTM produced. Particularly affects the RTM. The liners will come in on a steady basis, but it'll dictate the time it takes. The 6,000 CFS tunnel roughly moves at about 2 miles a year. And then the length of it, obviously, is how much of that spoil comes back out. So the engineering team is looking at the drives. They're in the 10 to 15 mile range. You can see the delta laid out there for our, the NOP corridors. They're about 40 miles from one end to the other as the crow flies. So for that length, we're looking at between 3 and 4 tunnel drives. That'll be these drive sites Andrew talked about. Or three to four tunnel drives at 2 to 3 launch sites. And the reason that's less is because at some of these sites we may drive in both directions. So there would be 2 tunnel drives. So a lot of this information that you see, it would be double at that site. And then there'd be 2 to 3 retrieval shafts, obviously, for taking the machines back out. Some of those would be combined as well. Next one, please. So you have these lookup tables. There's the example of one on the big chart here that are in your package. So each table is set up around one of the capacity alternatives between 3,000 and 7,500. Most of what we talk about in the meetings are the 6,000 table. That example is 6,000. It's the same one that's over here. So there's preliminary information. It tells you the tunnel diameter for that capacity. It tells you the speed at which the tunnel would move ahead. It talks about how many transportation trips, so these would be round trips, for the trucks that bring the liners. It talks about the RTM production and how much it would be, area you'd need to stockpile it at different depths. And again, the transport trips it would take to haul that away. So the transportation calculations are based on trucking, rail, and barge. And I want to make sure that people understand this. When you see these things, it's not trucking, rail, and barge. Each of these are individually set up. So the trucking numbers are as if everything came on trucks. The train numbers are as if everything went on trains, and so on. So it's not, don't add them together. And I want to, this is a really important point. You had these tables before. They're different today, the ones we handed out, and they're probably going to be different in the future. This is preliminary data. We're constantly working and figuring this stuff out a little bit better, and we refine these tables and give them to you that's up to date with what we're doing. Okay, the next one, please. So just real quickly, as an example, the internal tunnel diameter is a function of flow. You can see the diameter for the flow rate. The external diameter then is a function of that, so that's the thickness of the liner, gives you the outside of the bore. And then the speed is also tied to, obviously a bigger tunnel doesn't move as fast as a smaller tunnel. So the distance per year is based on 2 10-hour shifts, 5 days a week as you move down through the 2 10-hour shifts, 5 days a week. Next one, please. And then the segment deliveries, the daily number of segments again, this is tied to the diameter, and obviously that's tied to the speed as well. So then, the bigger tunnels, it's a little thicker, so they weigh more, and they're bigger. So you can put less of them on a truck in some cases. So you'll see the variety of the deliveries, and the criteria for the deliveries are shown up at the top. For instance, the trucks are 10 hours a day, we've assumed, for truck hauling, 24 tons on a load. The rail cars are 100 tons per car, that's for a flatbed flat car. And barges, now barges can take more than 2,000 tons, but the 2,000-ton barges we're looking at can go pretty much anywhere we're looking at. So obviously, it's, okay, that's all right, we can move ahead. They can, and then the RTM, again, is the volume is clearly dependent on the diameter and how fast you move, right? So that's how much the dirt's coming out of the launch shaft. So if you go 10 miles and you say it was a 6,000 CFS tunnel we talk about, you know, and you went 10 miles and you piled it 10 feet high, it would take 240 acres, or at 15 feet high, it'd take 160. So all these tables are in the data there that you can look at. And then if we're going to haul it off-site, again, we look at 16 cubic yard trucks, that's roughly the 24 tons, or 65 cubic yards per car, again, 100 tons, that's a dirt car that you'd see on a railroad. And the barge is, the 2,000 tons is roughly 1,300 cubic yards. So again, the same numbers for the RTM as it's generated at the speed shown for each one of these tunnels. So again, if you want to use these as lookup tables, this is kind of how you use them. So lastly, over there in this area, there's these shaft logistical maps. And these maps, the first one here shows the green areas are areas that are accessible by a road and either a train or a barge. So they must have road access to get to them. But those are the sites we've determined are suitable to use as launch shafts because they have multiple access. There's also one for, I gotta make sure I get them in the right order. The next one is roads that are suitable for the heavy traffic. Now, it doesn't mean we don't have to improve those roads, but those are the major roads that are suitable for this kind of heavy access type traffic. That map back there shows where you can barge to, especially these 200-ton barges. There's another map that's not in here that we can provide you in the future that shows where we can land barges, because just because you can barge through a channel doesn't mean you can land there. And then the last one over there is where the railroads are and the areas where it's possible to put railroad access and landings.
Okay, instead of going ahead with clarifications, folks, what we're going to do is continue on with the next technical presentation. And then please make note so you don't forget what it was you wanted to ask. So we'll make sure we have time for that at the end there.
I'm Graham Bradner, so I'm going to review with you now the launch shaft siting study that we've been working on. We're going to focus on the approach, the methodology. We do want input, and I think our expectation is that, well, first of all of the backup tables and supporting figures are included in your handouts. And so we would like you to think about those, look at the criteria and the ranking and the scoring, and hopefully bring that feedback back to the next roundtable that we'll be having in 2 weeks. So I realize there certainly may be comments. I want to make sure that we all understand the approach and the methodology now and go through the process. So I'm going to see if this works. It doesn't sound like it does. Okay. No. Okay. Point it down? I think they're making fun of me. Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk through the citing methodology. This is all in your handout, so try and follow along. There's a couple different boards that are over here too that support what we're going to be talking about here. So the process, we use major criteria. We have 4 major criteria that we're looking at: construction considerations, geotechnical, geologic information, property and land use considerations, and then lastly, existing infrastructure considerations. Within those 4 major headings, there's a series of smaller sub-criteria that you can see within your handouts. I realize you can't see them on the PowerPoint slides here. Along with those, though, in between the major criteria and the sub-criteria is something that's indicated as an importance factor. And so this is how we take the specific rankings defined over here on the far right side of the table, multiplied times the importance factor, and then all those rack up to create a total score for the process. And so this is the approach that we're taking to look at and evaluate various sites from a design and construction perspective as suitable for potential launch sites. And again, I just want to reemphasize that this is a work in progress, and so we would welcome input on the importance factors, the sub-criteria, the ranking process. All of that is included in your packet for your review.
Can I just real quickly, I just want you all to know that this is design and construction considerations. Don't think for a minute that we're not also sensitive to environmental considerations. It's part of that boundary between DWR and the CEQA process and this process. There are a lot of other considerations that will go into this process overall, but our swim lane is sticking to these design and construction related issues. So.
Thank you. Okay, next slide. So we'll talk about the central alignment first. There are a couple of fixed points as we work, back up. So there's a couple of fixed points on the slide that I want to point your attention to. We're talking about intakes on the north end, and then a southern forebay location on the southern end. And then we're talking about the central alignment that connects those 2 points together within the NOP corridor. We've got a couple of key constraints that inform the process. As Phil pointed out, we've got shown here in the grayed out section, Staten Island, Venice, Mandeville, Bacon. Those are areas that are really difficult to access for a large civil construction project. So those are areas that don't have barge access and rail in addition to good quality roads. So graying or putting those as grayed out areas, then we start focusing in on the drive zones that would potentially be there. So if we stop short at Staten, we're looking at something in the 5 to 10 mile drive zone distance heading up north towards the intakes. Then as we look at the next potential drive zone, drive site, launch site B, this is down on Bolden Island. And so this would be an approximate 10 to 15 mile drive zone. The variable here is that it could potentially go in either direction. You could drive from Bolden to the north, or you could drive from the north down to Bolden. And so those are both potential options of variations on that. And then lastly, down at the southern forebay, the potential location of a southern forebay, driving north up to Bolden. The point here being that as a launch site down here by Clifton Court forebay, it would generate a lot of potential material that could be used for construction of the forebay embankments, because that material would be derived down at the launch site location. All right. Go back. I just want to make sure I hit the high points here. So with intakes at Site A, we've got avoiding Staten, potential impacts. One thing to point out here, an advantage up in this location is that we are very close to the railway there. That's on the other side of Interstate 5. Then moving down to launch site B, which is here on Bolden Island, there's some other potential advantages driving up from the southern forebay and potentially reusing 100% of that material. Okay, next slide. So now we're going to go in a sequence of 4 slides. We're going to look at the 4 different sites, we're going to focus on the central corridor. We'll do the central shaft site A, which is the northern site on the central corridor, and then we'll do shaft site B, which is the Bolden Island central corridor. So what you're seeing here is a series of blocks and areas. These are roughly about 250 to 300 acre blocks of area, and generally within the NOP corridor. These are the construction, the criteria and the sub-criteria with the importance factors. What you're seeing here is a color-coded depiction noted down on the bottom
We've got more favorable, those ranking a 4 or 5. So think back to your handout there. There were rankings identified between a 1 and a 5 for each of those. And so if it's a 4 or 5, it's a green. If it's a 3, acceptable, it's yellow. Or if it's less favorable, would be orange, would correspond to a 1 or a 2 in those rankings. So then we move through the various blocks of land, sites here, potential sites, and go through a process of screening each one of them based on all the criteria and sub-criteria that I described. So we're going to walk through each of the sites pretty quickly, just hitting the high points, but again, making sure to give time for comment and questions, and then also recognizing that you folks, I'm sure, are going to want to look at these on your own. Some factors at this site, just to point out, I mean, you can see in this case, proximity to barge routes, everything is all coming up orange, so that's an indication that barge routes really aren't a factor for the northern drive site along the corridor here. And then as we look at also proximity to existing high voltage substations or transmission lines, nothing's really there, so it's not a differentiator. So hence the fact that they're all the same color across the top there. But what is a factor in this case is proximity to roads and proximity to rail. Those are both heavy influences, and they're heavily weighted in the process as indicated by the importance factor. Also, this is a good time to point out there are a couple kind of pass-fail type criteria in the process. And so those are flagged up here on the top. And so only the sites that meet this pass-fail criteria for suitability of access for a big job like that, it's up here at the very top, and it's got an NA next to the importance factor. That's meaning that it meets that green criteria over there that Phil talked about. So those are the sites that do have multiple modes of transport. There are a few other pass-fail type criteria within the property and land use, conservation land, refuges, preserves, critical habitat. Any of the sites rank, if they land on that type of land use, then those are also not considered in the ranking process and excluded from the scoring and evaluation. So none of those are shown here. We've condensed it together just so that you don't see all the gray stuff in the blocks. So in this case, the areas that you can see the areas of different colors corresponding to the final rankings that are up here at the top of the table. Okay. Next slide, please. I'll move a little quicker through some of these other ones. I hope that's not too fast, but I explained a lot just in setting the stage on that first one. So then we'll try and get through them. So now we look at Bolden Island. This was shaft central alignment, shaft site B. So this is the potentially the receiving site from a southern long drive, and then there's other options for what could happen on Bolden Island here. What you really see with Bolden Island is that it's really not ranking any of the sites into the green for the final ranking, and that's largely due to a couple of key factors. Geotechnically, the geologic units and peat thickness are playing a role in those selections. And then also the different modes of access and transportation are pretty tight in there. So comparatively, these sites don't rank quite as high as some of the other areas that you might see. And that's because all of the scoring is computed together to figure out the bins of these three categories. And so you can see that come through in the final rankings. Next slide, please. So looking at the eastern corridor now, again, we'll touch on some of the main constraints here. We're looking at, we've got some grayed out areas. This is the Consumnes River Preserve here and Ringe Tract down here. Very difficult to access, doesn't meet the access requirements or desires for a large construction project. So those are grayed out and not considered in the ranking process. And then looking at the drive distances, a 10 to 15 mile drive zone, as we've been talking about earlier, puts you kind of in this neck of the woods south of the Consumnes River Preserve, down through Canal Ranch and sort of near the bottom of Brack Tract. And then another launch site B. This is down on Lower Roberts and a little bit of Jones here. This puts you in about a 10 to 13 mile drive zone, both from the launch site A as well as from Southern Forebay configuration. And similar to the central corridor, there would be the option of driving this way and generating more material down here as a drive site, or driving that way and generating more material up there as a drive site. But again, having the fixed points on the north and south with a drive site coming from the southern forebay area, generating material down there, and nothing driving from the intakes down, everything driving towards the intakes. Next slide. So now we're looking at the eastern alignment shaft site A. So here's the Consumnes River Preserve. Here's Interstate 5. Similar process that we just talked about for the other two sites. We've got the areas grayed out that are either on preserved land or inaccessible really for a large construction project like a launch site. And then looking at the key drivers here that are influencing the selection of sites. There's relatively good road access through there. And then in general over here, as we get towards I-5 and east of the Delta, the ground conditions are improving. Peat's thinning out or disappearing, and there's much firmer ground. So those are influencing a lot of the final rankings along this eastern corridor. Okay, next slide. And then east alignment shaft site B. So this is down on Lower Roberts and Jones. Here we've got the Stockton Deepwater Ship Channel just to the north of the site. So there's, in some of the areas, there's very good potential barge routes through there. The BNSF rail line running down through here, through the bottom of the area. So different types of access and logistics contributing to the ranking here. But there is, you can see in the geologic and geotechnical conditions, there is a lobe of peatier materials back in here, so we have sort of a degradation of the quality of the foundation down in this neck of the woods. And then existing infrastructure is a whole lot, there's a lot of different things going on there in terms of existing linear infrastructure, and that's really the case with all of the sites. So I think that's the end of the slides, yep. So,
yeah, now would be a good time. Thank you for your patience, guys, in holding off on this. So now we're ready for you folks to raise your questions. Barbara, go ahead.
I have two sets of questions. The first one from the first presentation. There was a description of reporting of spoils that would happen weekly as a result of construction. My question is, who is in charge of that reporting, DCA or DWR? That's the first part of a two-part question on that. I don't know if they can give that answer now.
So what was given was an example of a type of a sampling program that would be implemented. Nothing has been decided or approved yet, and during the environmental review process, the mitigation measure, also the permitting process, working with the other regulatory agencies, will determine the actual time frame for sampling and submission of the data.
So that means DWR is going to be the lead on the reporting.
DWR will be the owner and operator of the project and
Right.
will be responsible for compliance with the permits.
Does that mean you are the group that's going to be putting the data up for the public to see?
So the reporting program hasn't been determined yet, and that's something that you could submit a scoping comment on.
Okay. I will say that we have had to submit a Public Records Act request to get HABS data owned by DWR presently. That data was not made available upon request to Region 5. And so this is of the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board. So I'm looking for a very specific answer on accessibility to the public and frequency of the reporting. Because right now, going through this process and not being able to easily get HABS data from DWR causes skepticism in the community. My second question is on...
Barbara, let me... Any data that's legally available or legally allowed for us to release, we'll make it available. You know how those environmental test results come? There's like, hundreds of lines with ND.
Yep.
So, yeah, we'll do what we can to make that available
Okay.
during construction. It's years down the road, but yeah.
Okay, all right. And I guess then my question would be, how would it be reported out for ease of accessibility? So, because I
Can
did...
what? I mean, I'm probably talking out of school here, and if Carrie was here, she'd kick me. I'm not sure what Catherine will do. This is the kind of thing that as an SEC, if, you thought an independent monitor that represented you that would look at something. I mean, those are the kind of ideas that you should throw out here that would go into consideration for us. So,
I would say that one of the things that you all should really be thinking about is that there should be an ombuds person.
Yeah, exactly.
Who actually makes data very accessible in real time so the community groups do not have to go through PRA requests, and so that there could be proper oversight.
Yeah, perfect. Makes perfect sense.
So my next question has to do with launch site B for the eastern alignment. How many miles is that from the Port of Stockton?
I don't know.
The lower east one?
Yeah.
Can you go back to the?
There's a scale on the
Yeah, can you roll back to launch site B?
I've been playing with the scale with rulers at home.
Yeah, are you getting good at it?
Yeah.
This looks like a 1 mile. That's it right there. Yeah. So this is 1 mile. Port of Stockton is kind of right over here. So just guessing, it's in the it's in the 5 to 10 mile range, something like that.
5 to 10 mile. It looked closer. That's why I was asking the last map that was provided. It looked closer to me, actually, to the edge of the Port of Stockton.
Right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. This is. I think you're right. This is some rail. I think this is some edges. So, again, looking at the scale, I'm just looking at the scale. It's on the order of maybe 3 to 4, then I guess, to the edge there.
Okay. So then my second question is that the top end of that launch site. Has there been any analysis on how close it is to more urban housing? I guess from both directions, from the east and to the north.
So the screening process that went into this did consider sphere of influence maps published by each of the cities. And so, yes, we did consider it and look at the distance from sphere of influence. But that's the extent. I mean, we tried to keep everything at a pretty high level for this siting study and not dive too deep.
It would be great if sphere of influence for anything that is this massive that lines up closer on the eastern alignment be made available.
Okay.
Okay.
And next question, Ms. Ann.
So I have two questions. One's from the previous slides. Do you still plan to use conveyor belts to move that muck across farmland to the designated drying areas? And my second question is, I'm looking at the logistics lookup tab, and I'm not very good at math, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it says your tunneling speed is 2.2 miles per year. It's a 40-foot tunnel, so is that a 20-year build?
Well, remember there's like 4 tunnel drives. So the longest reach is probably 15 miles. So at 2, it's probably 7.5-ish, or I'm not exactly sure which table you're looking at, but let's just say it's 2 miles a year. And if it were 15 miles long, that would be 7.5 years. But because these tunnels be going at the same time, right? So if this isn't just one tunnel boring machine, remember we have 3 or 4 of these launch sites, and tunnels would be running at the same time on each of these reaches.
So then, of course, you're going to provide us with an analysis of the cumulative effect of all of those tunnel machines running all at the same time for noise and air and water.
Yeah,
and
as soon as we get everything cited, then we can start, and we figure out, is it coming by train, is it coming by barge? Then we can start putting all the pieces together for you. Yeah, no doubt.
And the conveyor thing, we haven't actually selected sites yet, but yeah, we would consider conveyors at some of these sites for how to move the material from the site maybe to a rail siding or something like that.
Okay, thank you.
I had a quick question. I'm sorry about that. So it was following up on yours, Anna. In terms of if you have a boring, a shaft site, you're going down a launch site, are there going to be like 2 tunneling machines going out like that at the same time, or just one and then one?
1 to 1.
Okay.
And is the build still scheduled to be 13 years? Is that still your rough estimate? Okay.
It's something like that.
Yes, go ahead, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you. One quick question. On your workforce, you're going to have 2 10-hour shifts a day. What's your anticipated labor load at each shift? And what's your plan for the care and feeding of them?
It's a good question. We'll follow up on that. We'll bring data in.
Okay. Thank you.
Personally, I think the food has to come to them, right? So that's all part of the detail of the logistics plans.
James.
Add a question on to that last one on a 20-hour workday. How close are you to residential? 'Cause, I mean, all day long you're watching trucks, and all night long you're hearing something. So, you only got 4 hours a day that nothing's happening. So how close, to people's houses are this?
Sites, I guess.
Good question. I think we had Douglas and then Jim.
This is the question about the barge. Well, I understand that every time the barge goes through a bridge, the bridge has to open up. So I just wonder the feasibility of using barge in the Delta at all. Because every time the bridge opens, all the traffic will be holding up.
Yes, I mean, that would be a factor, a consideration.
Okay.
One
Jim?
quick follow-up.
Oh, wait a minute, here's a follow-up right over here.
One quick, the 2 10-hour shifts is only for the tunnel drives. So like at the surface facilities, we're not going to, that's going to be, I'm assuming, about a 10-hour shift. So above ground stuff, like the intakes wouldn't be,
For 15 years, it's going to be bloody miserable.
Jim.
If you all decide to use rail, does this mean you have to build new sidings on existing rail lines?
Yes.
So then you're not going to build a spur to the launch sites, are you?
Probably both. The way the railroad company wants to work is they leave the cars on the siding, and then the construction contractor has their own mini railroad, if you will. And they pull the cars off the railroad's property, do what they're going to do, either empty them and put the empties back, or fill them and put the full ones back, and then the railroad picks them up on the siding and takes them away.
Okay, so you're going to build spurs.
Yeah.
Okay, so that means that it's subject to the Federal Railroad Administration, is it not?
I don't know.
It is. You don't have to, it is. Which means it's subject to NEPA, which, by the way, we can talk about because that's not CEQA. Just thought you'd be interested in that. So anyway.
I just wanted to note, as noted in the NOP, we do know that we will have to go through the NEPA process. It is something that once the NEPA lead agency has identified, that they will initiate with their notice of intent.
No, I understand that, but Federal Railroad Administration has its own set of NEPA requirements that aren't necessarily the same as Bureau of Reclamation or the Corps of Engineers or Fish and Wildlife Service or NIMS. So I'm just bringing it up and pointing it out. Thanks.
Okay, Mike and then Karen. Or Karen, you came first, I think. Karen and then Mike.
Okay, this is just kind of a question for during the construction. I presume that when you're drilling, you kind of go in a straight line. Is that correct?
More or less.
Okay. I guess my question is, because I know that there's an awful lot of natural gas pockets. Some are abandoned, some are, well, apparently I assume that there's still natural gas in them. And water pockets like in wells and abandoned wells. So my question is how do you avoid those? Because I can't imagine that the tunnel would go 4 feet to the right or 20 feet to the right and then 20 feet to the left. And then the follow-up question to that is, what happens if you accidentally pierce one of those? I'm just trying to understand what the cause and effect would be to the employees that are that are underground. I just want to, I'm just trying to visualize this whole thing.
So I'll just say something first related to this, and then hand it off. Within the siting study, recognizing this is a very high-level study, we do have considerations for existing gas wells and gas production zones with the intent to rank and evaluate all of the known information, and it's considered in the process. So first it's considered, and then from there I'll hand it over to.
Andrew, we need you on a mic. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so there will be an exploration program that determines, that essentially detects whether or not there are buried and abandoned wells, either for water or for natural gas and oil. So that has to happen well before the actual tunneling takes place, so that we know exactly where they are and can remove them ahead of time.
So you would actively remove, like, say, a natural gas pocket or something like that before you got to it, or
No,
what
the
is
actual well itself.
The actual well itself.
The natural gas is down thousands and thousands of feet.
Oh, okay, so it's not really in a consideration for this.
No, but the wells are.
The wells are, okay,
Making sure
gotcha.
that is an important part of this, of risk mitigation, I guess.
Right, okay. Huh, good question. Okay. Thank you. Wait a minute, not yet. Mike's next, I think.
Just being mindful of time, we have about 10 more minutes of discussion.
And again, we're here at the pleasure of the committee, so that's the time that we have at this point. Again, we can discuss further in a different dynamic. Go ahead, Mike.
Ventilation shafts? Anything else? Is ventilation just going to go up through the main launch, or is it going to be ventilated vertically through different reaches?
The ventilation primarily comes from the main launch, but as we go, we'll talk next week about the maintenance and obviously reception's not connected to it until you get there, right? So primarily ventilation comes from the launch shaft, and it's a pretty rigorous ventilation system.
Okay. And then we mentioned the depth, looking at the top of the tunnel about 100 feet below the surface, is that correct?
Roughly.
Okay, so I'm just thinking historical, geology, human, we still might be in the range of human habitation down that deep? Not so? Okay, I'm just thinking about deposition in the delta over the years and sea level rise in the last 10 to 15,000. I don't know how it pertains to the delta. I just know beyond the Golden Gate. So just a consideration. If it's out, that's great. I'd love to hear that. Thank you. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Gilbert's next.
Yeah, I just have a quick comment about the central alignment shaft A. I didn't hear all the reasons Staten was left out of the analysis, and I can understand if it's access and that sort of thing, but looking at the shaft A, either on Glanville Tract or New Hope Tract, you're going to be impacting a lot of permanent crops in those areas, whereas on Staten, you don't have the permanent crops, and that levee needs a lot of dirt, so that's one area you could actually take the RTM from the shaft to the levee, and you've got a favorable landowner there that'd probably be an area you can use a lot of your RTM.
Let's
I have a really quick question.
Quick one, go ahead, Jim.
I know this will be covered in CEQA, but my question is significant, not avoidable. Have you discussed at all or identified how the first responders are going to be informed of all the construction? I mean, are we looking at closed space, enclosed space entry? Are we looking at how does the volunteer fire departments in Cortland and Hood respond to something that's 190 feet below the ground?
So, as you mentioned, that is something that will be evaluated in the CEQA document related to the different public services around the areas and that evaluation. But I don't know if there's any additional safety information, DC.
I think the expectation is because of the lengths of the drives, the contractors will hire first responders and they'll be on site.
So now you've got a first responder site as well as everything else at the site?
Part of their office complex, and that will be the, what
So now you got 24-hour people, because even though you're going two 10s, that doesn't mean you turn off the lights and go home. I'm sure during that 4 hours, there's people down there pulling maintenance and all that. So you have people underground 24/7, 24/5 or whatever, and first responders waiting at, I don't think this has been discussed.
It's in the ITR, and I'm just going to speak from memory. I think if you can't have an emergency response within 30 minutes, you have to provide it on site as well. So depending on which site is selected and its access, obviously the I-5 corridor, there is a possibility that you have to maintain that on site. There's rules around that in the tunneling. Yeah, OSHA would know.
Public comment, if that's okay. Hi. Just kidding.
Just real quick, I think it'd be really helpful as we're beginning to consider tunneling and all that type of thing, the understanding of how tunneling operates as far as the potential for seismic issues due to the tunneling, boring, the drives, the motion of the drives and that type of thing as far as that is concerned. Subsidence, potential for hitting various unknown sand lenses, things of that nature. So I think that those types of things, just understanding what tunneling does in an unconsolidated soil like this is, I think it'd be very helpful for us to get a better understanding of what that type of thing is. And then also seismic vulnerability of the tunnel itself. We all know that the delta is a highly susceptible seismic area. How does tunneling, the actual lining of the tunnel, is that rated based on seismic strength of something like that? Details of that nature would be very helpful.
I'm going to take one more because I don't think we've heard from you yet, Sean, and so just give you an idea.
It'll be quick. This process created a geography to work from. What about the idea of us providing criteria that we find to be very important based on the stakeholders here, and you do an additional study that takes a look at how that might change that geography, either further refine it or maybe even shift the various priority levels?
It's kind of related.
That's exactly what we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay.
You guys will do the study, and then we can check it?
Yeah, it's a simple spreadsheet. Yeah, be glad to.
Okay. Then what I'm going to do is so we can move on. There's one more slide? Okay, one more slide. Let's do this.
Do you want me to read this, Catherine?
Catherine, this is yours.
Yeah, sure. I'm Sean, I'm glad you asked that last question, because that's exactly what we're looking for is, we, as engineers, have come up with, the process in planning is to come up with a set of criteria that is used to evaluate alternatives and then to apply those to a range of alternatives, and that's what we've done. And we've been very transparent and opaque exactly how we did that methodology and what the results were. So we're inviting you to take a look at that process and comment on the methodology, and if you have insights into other criteria or the weighting factors or how we measured each of those criteria, feel free to give us the input. And then we'll go back and take a look at that, and if we can use that to rescore it, that would, and come back to you with those results. That's exactly how we'd like this process to work. And we'd also like you to take a look at the results of the analysis, this green, yellow, and orange, and see if it kind of makes sense to you in terms of how you think about siting facilities. We gave you the tables so that you can see when you drive in two directions, you would double those values. You can see the difference between how high you stack up the stockpile of material, how much area you might need. So I think what we're saying is we've kind of given you all the tools that we use to do this assessment, and we'd like to hear your feedback on that process. And if there's any additional information you need to help with your analysis, just feel free to send in some questions, and we'll be as quick in the response as we can. Anna, I think you saw how quickly we can respond when you need something. So,
And Catherine, can you
So if anybody needs the hearings or these meetings, thank you. It's been a long day. If anybody needs these meetings that's from the Delta that would like a flash drive of the meetings, I will have them. I will carry them on me. If you need to get a hold of me, I'm happy to drop one off. Anyone to the public that would like to see these meetings, because our internet in the Delta is so slow, it's hard to see them. So I'll be the ferry of the USB drives.
That is so wonderful.
So, sorry, I just want to go back to what Catherine was saying before. I think it's really important that you guys do provide input on the criteria for this preliminary screening, but I did want to remind you guys that this is a preliminary screening for locations for launch shafts, and that there will be an environmental analysis that will likely shift these locations based on what we find in the analysis. But in order to do the more detailed analysis, we need to sort of narrow down the areas where we're going to be looking at.
Narrowed them down. Quick one. Yes.
7 years.
Should we also be considering where the inputs would be located as well, as far as keeping them in the same place? Or would they be able to go in a different location?
Intakes. Intakes.
Sorry, intakes.
Yeah.
I hate that question. I mean, I'm going to let Catherine answer that one.
I want to remind you guys all that we are in the scoping process right now, and so if there are suggestions related to alternatives, such as alternative locations for the intakes, that is something that you can submit as a scoping comment. I wasn't here last time when you guys got the presentation on intakes, but I do believe there are quite a few constraints as to why those were the intakes that were utilized in the NOP.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And Anna, thank you. That is a wonderful offer. I think everybody should be grateful for that. I'm going to take public comments now. Would you please? I've got.
Here, Barbara had one last question.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Is it possible to get the sphere of influence studies in order to do this work?
I'm not sure what that is. Sphere of influence?
That's what Graham was talking about.
Those are maps that we were able to obtain from the city, so Stockton, Lodi, Tracy, Elk Grove, so they're publicly available.
So it's not sphere of influence to your site?
No, it's sphere of influence of those communities.
Of those communities. Yeah. Okay, never mind.
Okay.
Okay. Now, I believe that's the microphone for public comment over there. Is that correct? Okay, then. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. I didn't see you down there.
The independent technical crew assessment, could we get those results?
Yeah, it's the Independent Technical Review Committee. The results of that are actually on the agenda for our next DCA board meeting, but we'll make sure the report makes its way into this meeting.
Good questions. Okay, then I do have the public. We ready for public comments now? Yes. Okay. I would like you to make sure you speak into the microphone over there, and please keep your comments to 3 minutes or less. Thank you. I'm going to call OSHA Reserve, please.
Good afternoon. I guess it is on. OSHA Reserve here for local agencies of the North Delta. I had a chance to look through the question tracking log, and I just had some comments on a couple of the answers that were provided that I wanted to mention briefly, and I'm sure we could follow up more, but I guess I'm just concerned that some of the answers being provided are not accurate. So the first one I wanted to mention is on question number 40 on page 3, talks about the availability of geotechnical data. And it mentions that with respect to the California Water Fix project that an administrative record was prepared, and it seems to allude that all that material would be available. I want to inform you that the administrative record was never completed, and even the litigants were never provided with all the documents. What we had was an index. So I do believe that that data is public and should be provided if members of the stakeholder group are asking for it. In addition, the well data it says that it's private information. Actually, DWR keeps a database of well data. There may be certain parts of it that are private, but they have a database, and it was required by Sigma that it be made public. And I know the counties certainly can request that information, and I would imagine it could be made available to stakeholders as well. With respect to page 7, question number 52, it says that the screens are going to be designed to exclude smell. This answer does not disclose that the project would take or kill smell, even if they're designed to exclude smell. So I think that's misleading. Also, it says that they can't have screens at the South Delta. It fails to recognize that the biological opinions actually include studies that need to be prepared in order to minimize or reduce take in the South Delta, and it may not be screens, but there's other measures that are available. Page number 9, question 59, says intakes are being designed for gravity flow, but I don't think that's correct either because there's pumps at the south end of the project. So this is not a gravity project. It requires a very large amount of electricity. The other question was the scoping meeting will be in Reading, I see, because I got an email while I was sitting here. And last comment, the potential for, someone asked about the potential.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Your time is up. Thank you. Okay, next is Matt Conover.
Actually,
I think there was a miscommunication. She wasn't at 3 minutes. I was just making sure that we were doing 3 minutes. She had another 25 seconds if she wants to ask that question really quickly.
Well,
that was a miscommunication between us. I'll own that.
All right, let me just quickly say then that there was a question about the potential for intakes to help control flood. It was, I think, said that that's part of the environmental review process. I guess if you guys are saying that there ought to be some local benefits of this project, I think that it should be up for discussion in this committee about whether it might be possible to help control flooding with intakes. Thanks.
Thank you. Good point. Okay.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much.
Apologize, Mr. Osha. Okay, Matt Conover. Sorry. And I can see this now, so this is good. Thank you.
My name is Matt Conover from Reclamation District 1002 and John McCormick Company. We're in that green area at the top of the map with all the green. It's above the start of both of those corridors and above that gray area that cuts across. That is the McCormick-Williamson tract, co-owned by the Nature Conservancy and DWR at the mouth of the Cosumnes Refuge. And it connects down the McCullamy and Snodgrass Slough to Staten Island. All that gray on the west side corridor, we'll call it Central Corridor, is not to be, well, it's unfavorable. So the trend of that map is to go down the right side, but we're in the area at the top, so that would also run your intermediate forebay and first launch site north of us and goes south through all our area, which is about 200 acres for our ranches and 5,000 acres and 52 landowners up where you're talking about covering with water and your launch sites. So there's social and economic impacts already up there. Plus that's one of the last undammed rivers in California, and floods, and the environmental people have prevented a flood control dam higher in the canyon. That's flooded in the past, in 1996, 15 feet deep, and lasted for months in the area where you want to have a staging area. So you better build big levees. We have 18-foot high levees, and the instrumentation gauges forecasted up to 20 feet 3 years ago, which would have washed any cars over the top with 2 feet of water flooding down into that. That's the foot of the irrigation or the reclamation district. So your designs, if you're going to have big launch shafts with boreholes 50 feet wide going straight down, should have some kind of floodgate doors over the top to prevent flooding if your levees break, like ours were rumored to 3 times. We had 3 evacuations in one season. And that gray area with the Nature Conservancy, they have told the Delta Stewardship Council that their plan is to break down our levees and flood us out all the way up to Delta Shores Mall by South Sacramento. So you're going to have that conflict. Thank you.
Good timing. Okay. Okay, all right, the next, thank you, Mr. Conover. Robert Swenson.
So I just want to give my input as a member of the Delta. My name is Robert Swenson, and I'm a junior at Delta High School. I've lived in Clarksburg since I was in 5th grade, and I consider this my home. My friends, my neighbors, my community have all supported me and shaped who I am and the adult I am becoming. For example, members of this community created a youth group for young adults like me to promote honesty, hard work, and integrity. We learned that we always had the people of Clarksburg right behind us in times of need, and that the world is not a lonely one. I want future generations to have the same experience that I had as a child. I want this nurturing community to continue to positively help shape kids at critical times, just as Clarksburg and this ag community has done for me. Plans of creating the tunnels would deter members of this fine community from being able to remain here. It would destroy the bond that the people of Clarksburg and the larger Delta communities have with one another by creating unlivable conditions, dewatering, increased air pollution, increased traffic construction, increased noise pollution, and loss of prime agricultural land. Not only has this community supported me, but has also taught me so much. In the last few years, I've interned for local multi-generational farmers who enjoy teaching me about farming in the Delta. The knowledge that the farmers know is unbelievable and is all the result of generations of family farming here. The wisdom that they bestow upon me was once bestowed upon them by their mentors or bosses or family. However, my generation could be the last to have a personal connection to agriculture in the Delta if the tunnel is built. Delta farmers simply cannot continue their livelihoods if they are impacted by the building process for 13 years. That is a long time to expect farmers to wait to come back to their historical land. Kids like me are at risk of losing the opportunity to learn from the farmers and continue the honorable tradition of family farming in the Delta. I hope that alternatives to taking away prime farmland from farmers would be considered. Thank you for your time.
All right, now we've got Tim Naharth. Oh, sorry, that's Newharth, is that it?
I'm sorry?
Did I say your name correctly?
Close. It's Newharth.
Newharth.
Thank you.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity for us local residents to come here and have some input into what's being said here and considered here this evening. Appreciate that very much. In reading your purpose here on your handout today, it says stakeholders to provide input and feedback on technical and engineering issues related to the DCA's current activities. I think any engineering endeavor or technical endeavor has got to include a cost analysis. I have not heard any cost analysis of any of this evening or any other time. I heard the figure of 12 billion stated the other night, which in my opinion, and after being in this fight for the last 10 years, is a ridiculously low figure. So my question to this board is, what are you considering for costs here? We have seen a multitude of different aspects of this project considered here tonight. And that's just a drop in the bucket. We've talked about building roads, we've talked about boring shafts, we've talked about pads for the intake facilities, on and on and on it goes. Dewatering and all this stuff. I'd like to know just how much does each one of these aspects gonna cost? Has there been a cost analysis done on each one of these things other than just lumping it all together and saying, well, we think it's gonna be 12 billion? I doubt that seriously. And I'd like to know, there has to be somebody who has done a study on what cost overruns generally amount to in the state of California. There has to be a study out there somewhere. that says it's 50% over projected costs, it's 120% over projected costs, whatever. Because I bring this up to you because we have the high-speed rail project that has gone astronomical the last time I heard. I don't remember the figure, but it was way in the billions, with an estimated time, a revised estimated time of 2031. We have the Bay Bridge that started out at 1.9 billion, and it is now tenfold over that original cost at 19 point whatever and counting.
15 seconds.
Thank you. So what I'm trying to make my point is here is that if you're going to have feasibility studies or engineering studies or whatever, that has to include cost analysis that are reasonable and the overruns expected just because of the general nature of construction and long-term large projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, then we have Melinda Terry.
Thank you. Melinda Terry, Executive Director of the Central Valley Flood Control Association. And while I may be skeptical about whether the input here really changes the design, I still really appreciate, having the venue and the opportunity for, to at least share some of these things. So to follow up on Rob's comments, about prime farmland, it's hard, to not notice, these maps and what will get lost. So I hope in the methodology and criteria, one things that you'll look at is, using the lands that are owned by DWR and Metropolitan Water District, particularly for muck piles, let them have that instead of converting our prime farmland for a lot of these. But same goes for all your other siting things. It just would be nice to not lose as much as it looks like we're going to be. And following up on Mel's question and comments about the seismic of a boring machine, if you look back at your last meeting, it's not just that. It's the pile driving for more than 20 locations, It's not just the intakes, but the intakes are a big part of it, and the cofferdams. It's the truck traffic itself creates vibrations and shaking. And so there's a cumulative impact. And while we feel fairly confident that the levees will hold an earthquake is very short term, a few minutes maybe. You're talking every day this vibration is going on for 20 hours a day for the boring machine, and who knows for the other activities. So it's the cumulative impact is much different than an earthquake. So might feel good about the levees in a short-term quick earthquake. Napa wasn't that far, the last big one, and they held. But the cumulative seismic of all the truck traffic, pile driving, boring machines, and dewatering, by the way, because those are pumps every 75 feet. Those are also going to cause a lot of vibration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, that concludes our public comments. And so now, for the next meeting, we are going to be meeting at the Bellevue location where we were last time, and that will again be at, I believe, 3 to 6 again, and that is, that's where we are. So anything else we need to add?
Just a reminder, please, Catherine went over some of those prompts, and it seems like everyone really appreciated the prompts for this meeting. So if you could please keep those near and dear and close to your heart so that as you're talking to folks, that's the kind of input that's really, really helpful as we're able to move forward. We're always here for clarification, without question, but if you're looking for input and talking to your folks, that's the type of information that we need as we're moving forward.
Right, and your input, of course, was excellent as usual, but yeah, I understand this is controversial for everybody. And so at that point, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much.